Right now, in the middle of most conversations happening on the planet, one of three things is occurring inside the listener's head. They're waiting for their turn to speak. They're already composing their response, half-tuned to whatever's still being said, or they've drifted somewhere else entirely, nodding on autopilot while their mind runs its own separate errands. What almost none of them are doing, despite every appearance to the contrary, is actually listening. This isn't a character flaw, and it isn't rudeness. It's closer to architecture. The mind wasn't built to sit still and absorb one other person's thoughts without interruption. And understanding exactly why explains something that goes well beyond conversation etiquette. It explains a surprising amount of why relationships quietly fail, one unremarkable exchange at a time, long before anything dramatic ever happens. Start with what listening actually asks of the brain, because the demand is larger than it looks from the outside. Harvard Business School professor Alison Wood-Brooks, who has spent years running experimental studies on what separates good conversations from forgettable ones, has described listening as deceptively simple on the surface, precisely because the human mind was never built to track one person and one idea with total uninterrupted focus. Brains are built to wander. They're constantly drawing connections between the sentence someone just said and something entirely unrelated sitting in the back of your attention. A task you forgot, an appointment later that day, a memory the conversation happened to brush against. This wandering isn't a malfunction. It's closer to the mind's resting operating mode, the state it defaults to whenever it isn't being forced to concentrate on an external task. Listening, in the way it's usually imagined, asks the mind to override that default and hold still. That override takes real finite effort, which is exactly why it degrades the moment attention gets pulled anywhere else, including toward planning what you're about to say next. Here's where most advice on this topic goes wrong. It treats listening as a set of visible behaviors to perform. Nodding, maintaining eye contact, saying at the right intervals. And while those behaviors aren't meaningless, they can all be executed flawlessly by someone who has completely checked out. This is performative listening, and it's worth naming directly because it's what most people are actually doing most of the time while believing they're engaged. The distinction between performative and genuine listening isn't about how convincing the performance is. It's about whether the mind is actually building on what's being said or simply waiting for a gap to insert what it already had planned to say. And there's a specific, well-documented behavior that gives this distinction away almost every time. One Brooks and her colleagues have studied directly in a pattern they call boomer asking. It works like this. Someone asks a question, the other person answers, and the asker immediately pivots the conversation back to themselves without engaging with the answer at all. Psychologist Michael Yeomans, working with Brooks and colleagues, has shown that listeners reliably register this pattern as insincere, even when the original question sounded genuinely curious in the moment it was asked. The question wasn't actually about the other person. It was a boomerang, thrown out only so the asker could get back to talking. And people can tell the difference, often without being able to say exactly how they know. The one variable that actually moves connection. This is where the research gets specific. In a way, most conversation advice never does. Brooks and her collaborators, including Yeomans and Harvard Kennedy School psychologist Julia Minson, analyzed real conversations, including speed dating interactions, and identified several distinct types of questions people ask. Introductory questions that open a conversation, mirror questions that simply reflect a question back, topic-switching questions that change the subject, and follow-up questions, which build directly on something the other person just said. Of these four types, follow-up questions were the ones specifically and consistently associated with being liked more, and with conversations rated as more engaging and more successful. In the speed dating research Brooks and colleagues examined, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, participants who asked more follow-up questions were more likely to be selected for a second date, not questions in general, not more talking overall. Specifically, the subtype of question that can only be asked if you were actually listening to the previous answer closely enough to find something in it worth asking about further. This detail matters more than it first appears to, because it means the generic advice to just ask more questions, the advice dominating almost every article on this topic, is measurably too vague to work. A stranger firing off a list of prepared questions isn't listening. They're interviewing. A follow-up question can't be prepared in advance because it doesn't exist until the other person has said something specific enough to respond to. It's structurally proof of attention in a way that no amount of nodding or eye contact can fake. There's a reason genuine listening and the follow-up questions it produces feels effortful, even for people who want to do it. Psychologist Michael Kardas, working with Amit Kumar and Nicholas Epley, studied what happens when people consider having a deeper, more personal conversation rather than sticking to safe surface-level small talk. Their research found people consistently underestimated how much they'd enjoy the deeper conversation, and specifically underestimated how much their conversation partner would care about what they had to say. This miscalibration creates a quiet incentive to keep things shallow, to ask the easy generic question rather than following a thread into something more specific and more revealing. Because the deeper thread feels, in advance, both harder to manage and less welcome than it actually turns out to be once the conversation is underway. This is worth returning to directly because it's easy to lose the thread here among all the research. We still haven't fully explained why listening degrades specifically at the moment it matters most. In conversations with people you already know well, not strangers at a speed dating event. And the answer connects back to the wandering mind described earlier. With someone unfamiliar, novelty itself pulls attention along and does some of the work for you. With someone familiar, a partner, an old friend, a parent, the mind assumes it already knows roughly what's coming. And that assumption is precisely what gives it permission to drift, to start composing a response, or reaching for its own related story, before the other person has actually finished saying something new. What actual listening looks like in the brain. There's a further layer to this worth including, because it moves the discussion out of self-report and into something more directly observable. Neuroscientist Thalia Wheatley at Dartmouth has used hyperscanning, a technique that measures brain activity in two or more people simultaneously during a real interaction, to study what happens neurally when a conversation is going well. Her research and that of her collaborators has found that during genuinely engaged conversation, patterns of brain activity between speaker and listener show measurable synchrony, a coupling that increases when people are actually attending to and building on what the other person is saying, rather than simply taking turns speaking past each other. Related work from Wheatley's lab, led by researcher Emma Templeton, found that faster response times between conversational turns, meaning shorter gaps before a listener responds, were associated with people reporting feeling more socially connected during the exchange. A fast response isn't valuable because speed itself is impressive. It's valuable because it's a signal that the listener was already tracking, ready, present in the sentence as it was being said, rather than needing a pause to catch back up. A long gap often means the listener drifted and had to reconstruct what was just said before they could respond to it. The synchrony Wheatley's research measures directly at the level of brain activity is essentially the neural signature of the thing. Follow-up questions demonstrate behaviorally, real-time tracking of another mind, rather than a private monologue running in parallel to a conversation happening nearby. The actual change, put all of this together, and a single specific adjustment falls out of it, distinct from the usual pile of listening tips. It isn't maintain eye contact or don't interrupt, useful as those might be. It's this. The next thing you say in a conversation should, more often than it currently does, be built directly out of the last specific thing the other person said, rather than out of something you were already planning to say before they finish saying it. That's a narrower, more demanding standard than it sounds like, because it rules out the two most common conversational habits at once. It rules out boomer asking, the reflexive pivot back to yourself, and it rules out the prepared question, the one that would have been asked regardless of what the other person actually said, because it wasn't built from their answer. It was just next on the list. What it requires instead is holding a thought open, unresolved, until the other person has actually finished, and then building the next thing out of the specific material they just handed you, rather than the material you walked in already holding. This is, in the end, why so much conversation feels technically fine and quietly unsatisfying at the same time. Nothing rude happened, nobody was interrupted, and yet nothing built on anything either. Two people took turns speaking near each other, and then rather than actually speaking with each other. And both walked away with the vague, hard-to-name sense that they hadn't really been heard, because in the most literal, mechanistic sense, they hadn't been. So the next time you're in a conversation with someone you actually care about, notice the exact moment your mind starts drafting its response while they're still mid-sentence. That moment is not a flaw in your character. It's the mind doing what it was built to do by default. The only question is whether you let the draft take over or whether you set it down. Stay in their sentence a little longer than feels natural, and ask about the specific thing they just said, instead of the thing you were already prepared to say. That single substitution made consistently is closer to the actual mechanism of being listened to than anything on a checklist could ever produce.